So I'll go into a quick explanation for how we predict the moon phases using a calendar and knowledge of some of the previous moon phases. A couple of things to keep in mind that you should already know about the lunar cycle. It begins with a new moon, takes approximately 28 days to go through the whole cycle, and from a new moon to a full moon takes about 14 days. A really important thing to remember is that if you look at your moon phases diagram, which you would probably want to have out in front of you at some point, any of your moon phases that are across from each other on the lunar cycle are always 14 days apart, because that's half of the full circle. 28 divided by 2 is 14. This is one version of the lunar calendar for this year. This is just for your viewing pleasure. You'll notice that there is a new moon and a full moon found in every single month. We do not have any blue moons this year, and a blue moon is when you have two full moons in one month at the very beginning and the very end. So if we do know that our lunar cycle takes like 28 days, we can predict new moons by finding the date of the previous. So let's say we know that there's a new moon on September 7th, 2018. We can predict when the next new moon would be just by bumping ahead 28 days. Now, an easier way to do this is to look at it in terms of weeks. If this is the 7th, and we know that 28 days is approximately 4 weeks, then we know that if we move over 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, our next new moon would probably fall somewhere around October the 5th. Keep in mind that that date is just an approximate date. It isn't perfectly exact. So, how can we use this information to also predict our next full moon? Well, if you have your moon diagram in front of you, you'll recall that the full moon and the new moon are across from each other in terms of the cycle. So, what that means to us is that if they're across from each other, there is a difference of 14 days or 2 weeks. So, if the new moon was on September 7th, like we said before, then all you would have to do is move ahead 2 weeks and you would find your full moon. So if here's the 7th, we'd go 1 week, 2 weeks. That means that our full moon would be on September the 21st. So what if we have a waxing gibbous moon on Wednesday, September the 19th, which is here? What date could we expect to see a waning crescent moon? So take a look at your diagram. If you look at your diagram, you're going to see that a waxing gibbous moon and a waning crescent moon are directly across from each other. So just like the new moon and the full moon, these two moons, because they're across from each other, are approximately 14 days apart, which means that's 2 weeks. So to find this waning crescent date, we would start here. 1 week would be on the 26th, and 2 weeks would be somewhere around October the 3rd. So let's say we have a first quarter moon, and that's occurring on Monday, October the 8th, as you see here. What date would we have seen the new moon before that first quarter moon? So if you look at your diagram, you're going to see that a first quarter moon comes just about right after the new moon. There's a waxing crescent in between it, but when you're looking at your 4 points, think north, south, east, and west, or if you think of taking that circle and separating it into 4 quarters, that first quarter moon is 7 days away from the new moon. So 7 days later, you would see a first quarter moon, which means if we have the first quarter moon here on the 8th, 7 days ago would have been the new moon that came before it. So that just means that the new moon would have fallen around Monday, October 1st. What moon phase could we see on Saturday, October the 20th, if there was a waxing crescent moon on Saturday, September 22nd? So if you look at this one and just kind of think for a second, this is September 22nd. This is October 20th. Those two dates are approximately a month apart. And we can actually look at it and verify that. 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks. So with that being said, we know that in order to complete the entire cycle takes 4 weeks or 28 days, which means if we were starting with a waxing crescent and 4 weeks pass, we're right back where we started. So that would mean October the 20th would also have a waxing crescent moon. So then let's take what I showed you and let's look at it in terms of some shorter questions. We have a new moon on January 8th. What date will we observe the first quarter? Well, as I mentioned to you before, there is 7 days in between all of our main points. 7 days between a new moon and a first quarter, 7 days between a first quarter and a full moon, 7 days between a full and a third quarter, and 7 days between a third quarter and new moon. So 7 times 4 gives us 28. So if there was a new moon on January 8th, our first quarter moon would be 1 week later or 7 days later on January 15th. If we observe a full moon on January 12th, what date would we observe the next new moon? A full moon and a new moon are directly across from each other on the diagram. Since they're directly across from each other, that would be a difference of 2 weeks or 14 days. So if we move ahead 1 week, 2 weeks, that would be January the 26th. If you observe a waxing crescent on January 28th, how many weeks ago did you observe a waning gibbous? Waxing crescent and waning gibbous are across from each other on the diagram, so we know that that's a difference of 2 weeks, which means that would be 14 days ago or 2 weeks ago, which would be on January the 14th. And then finally, if you observe a waxing gibbous moon on January the 5th, how many days later would you observe a waning gibbous? So if you look at where a waxing gibbous is on the diagram, it's just before a full moon. Waning gibbous is just after a full moon. Since the full moon is the phase in between, we know that the difference between every other phase is 7 days. Go back to what I said before. From a new moon to a first quarter, 7 days. There's a phase in between that. From a first quarter to a full moon, 7 days. There's a phase in between there. Full moon to third quarter, there's 7 days and a phase in between, and so on. So if you have a phase between the waxing gibbous and the waning gibbous, which is the full moon, that would be a difference of 7 days. So that means you would observe that waning gibbous 7 days later on January the 12th. Be sure to let me know if you have any questions regarding how to predict your moon phases. One of the most important things to keep in mind is you need to be very familiar with the moon phase diagram. You pretty much have it memorized. The diagram will not be given to you on the quiz or the test. So it is important that you're able to put it down on paper yourself as scratch work so you can use the diagram to make these questions so much easier to answer. As long as you have the diagram, you can count days and weeks based on the order of those phases.